The scene on the dusty testing grounds of Egypt in 1942 was deceptive in its simplicity, yet it marked a pivotal divergence in military philosophy that would ripple through the entirety of the Second World War. A batch of early American M1 bazookas had arrived, fresh from the factories, intended to solve the most terrifying tactical problem of the age, the dominance of German armor. British commanders watched as the American weapon was demonstrated against the hull of a captured Panzer III. The rocket hissed from the tube, struck the steel plate, and detonated. The penetration was successful, and the weapon functioned exactly as advertised. To the shock of American observers, the British response was a polite but firm refusal. This decision, often misconstrued by history as a moment of stiff upper-lip arrogance or bureaucratic stubbornness, was in reality a calculation born of grim pragmatism. The British were not rejecting the concept of a man-portable anti-tank weapon. They were rejecting the specific limitations of the rocket because they had already committed their industrial might to a weapon that operated on entirely different principles. It was a device that looked like a piece of agricultural machinery, felt like a burden, and kicked like a mule, but it possessed a singular tactical advantage that the sleek American bazooka lacked. To understand why the British embraced the projector, infantry, anti-tank, better known as the PIAT, one must first understand the sheer desperation of the infantryman's plight in the early years of the war. By 1941, the balance of power on the battlefield had shifted violently in favor of the tank. The German Panzer III and IV, with their 30 to 50 mm of frontal armor, often sloped to deflect incoming fire, had rendered existing infantry countermeasures obsolete. The British soldier had gone to war with the Boy's anti-tank rifle, a heavy, bolt-action weapon firing a .55 caliber round. While it had been effective against light tanks in the 1930s, against modern German armor, it was effectively a nuisance weapon. It could penetrate perhaps 21 mm of armor at 300 yards, meaning a British soldier had to let a panzer get terrifyingly close to even scratch its paint. Conventional anti-tank guns were effective but were heavy, crew-served weapons weighing thousands of pounds that could not be moved quickly. The infantry needed a pocket artillery capability, something a single man could carry to kill a tank before the tank killed him. The solution lay in the physics of the shaped charge, known as the Monroe effect. Physicists had realized that a cone of copper, backed by high explosives, would collapse upon detonation into a hypersonic jet of molten metal capable of punching through armor far thicker than the warhead's diameter. The theoretical problem was solved. The engineering challenge was how to deliver this warhead to the target without killing the operator. The Americans and Germans looked at the problem and chose rocketry, a logical solution that used a burning motor to propel the warhead. The British, however, turned to a sprung steel rod and the eccentric genius of Lieutenant Colonel Blacker. Blacker was a veteran of the Indian Army and an aviation enthusiast who had spent the interwar years tinkering with unconventional ordnance. In 1930, he patented the spigot mortar, a counterintuitive design where there was no barrel in the traditional sense. Instead, a solid steel rod, the spigot, served as the guide. The projectile, which had a hollow tail containing the propellant charge, sat over this rod. When the trigger was pulled, the rod struck the percussion cap inside the tail, igniting the charge. The resulting explosion did two things simultaneously. It launched the bomb forward and drove the heavy spigot rod backward against a massive spring, recocking the weapon for the next shot. It was a closed system where all the energy went into the projectile and the recoil absorption. There was no expanding gas escaping a tube, and crucially, there was no backblast. This mechanism was the heart of the PIAT, a weapon that was refined by Major Millis Jefferies at MD1, Winston Churchill's secret weapons laboratory known affectionately as the Toy Shop. Jefferies took Blacker's unwieldy prototypes and combined the spigot concept with the newly developed hollow-charge technology from the sticky bomb. By August 1942, a full month before the bazooka arrived in Egypt for its failed audition, the PIAT was already in production at a factory in Billingham. The resulting weapon was a beast. It weighed 32 pounds, nearly double the weight of the American bazooka, and measured 39 inches in length. It looked crude, welded together from cheap metal stampings, earning it the nickname, the plumber's nightmare. However, its crude appearance belied its effectiveness. It fired a 3.5-inch diameter bomb with a muzzle velocity of 250 feet per second. While this was slow, resulting in a distinct arc that required skill to judge, the bomb could penetrate up to 100 millimeters of armor, enough to defeat the side and rear armor of any German tank in existence, and theoretically the frontal armor of many. The primary complaint regarding the PIAT was the sheer physical exertion required to operate it, specifically the cocking mechanism. Unlike the trigger and battery simplicity of the bazooka, the PIAT required the operator to manually compress the massive mainspring if it failed to recock itself after firing, or for the first shot. This was a Herculean task. The drill required the soldier to stand up, often in the middle of a firefight, place the weapon on its butt, step on the shoulder padding to anchor it, unlock the body, and then haul the casing upward with their entire body weight. It required approximately 200 pounds of force to latch the spring. Smaller soldiers simply could not do it. Training manuals optimistically suggested that recocking could be done while lying prone, but soldiers on the ground noted that this was nearly impossible without immense strength and awkward contortions. Furthermore, the recoil was legendary. The heavy spigot slammed forward a split second before the round launched, throwing off aim, and then the explosion drove it back with bruising force. Soldiers learned to leave a gap between their shoulder and the pad to avoid injury, and trigger discipline was essential not just for safety, but to avoid flinching in anticipation of the kick. Despite these ergonomic nightmares, the PIAT possessed the single tactical advantage that justified its existence over the bazooka. It could be fired from enclosed spaces. The American M1 bazooka, for all its futuristic allure and lightweight handling, had a fatal flaw in urban or covert combat. When the rocket motor ignited, it expelled a stream of high-velocity gas and flame out the rear of the tube. This backblast created a danger zone extending 15 meters behind the operator. If a soldier fired a bazooka from inside a small room, the overpressure and reflected blast could kill or severely injure everyone inside. In the open field, the backblast kicked up a massive cloud of dust and debris, instantly revealing the shooter's position to every enemy tank and machine gunner in the vicinity. The PIAT, by contrast, was a cold launch. There was no flash, no backblast, and very little smoke. The only sound was a dull, mechanical thud, often lost in the din of battle. This meant a British paratrooper could hide in a ruined house in Arnhem, fire a PIAT through a window at a passing German half-track, and remain completely undetected. This capability proved decisive in the specific theaters where British troops found themselves fighting. In the hedgerows of Normandy, where engagement ranges were terrifyingly short and concealment was life itself, the PIAT allowed infantry to ambush tanks from heavy cover without stripping away their own camouflage with a rocket plume. In the rubble of Italian towns during the grinding advance up the peninsula, the ability to fire from deep inside a building turned every window into a potential anti-tank emplacement. The numbers bore this out. According to British Army analysis of the initial period of Operation Overlord, PIAT teams were responsible for destroying 7% of all German tanks knocked out by British forces. This statistic is staggering when one considers the volume of fire from artillery, aircraft, and other tanks. In fact, the humble, spring-loaded PIAT destroyed more German armor in Normandy than the high-tech, rocket-firing RAF Typhoons, whose claims of tank kills were often found to be exaggerated upon post-battle inspection. The effectiveness of the PIAT is perhaps best illustrated by the extraordinary bravery of the men who wielded it, leading to the award of 6 Victoria Crosses, the highest decoration for valor in the British military, to PIAT operators. This was more than any other infantry anti-tank weapon of the war. One such recipient was Fusilier Francis Jefferson. In May 1944, during the assault on the Gustav Line at Monte Cassino, Jefferson saw a German tank counterattack threatening his unit. With the leading anti-tank team dead, the 23-year-old grabbed a PIAT and sprinted forward across open ground, ignoring the machine gun fire tearing up the earth around him. He engaged the lead tank at point-blank range, destroying it instantly. He then reloaded and drove off a second tank. Jefferson knew that at such short range, missing meant certain death, yet he held his nerve. Another legendary figure was Major Robert Kane, the only man to receive the Victoria Cross at Arnhem and survive the battle. Over 6 hellish days, Kane used the PIAT to disable or destroy multiple Tiger tanks and self-propelled guns. The sheer violence of the weapon took a toll on him. At one point, a PIAT bomb detonated prematurely in the tray, blinding him temporarily and bursting his eardrums. Despite the agony, he refused evacuation, stuffed field dressings into his bleeding ears, and returned to the line, shouting for someone to guide his aim until his sight returned. Private Ernest "Smoky" Smith of the Canadian Army earned his VC at the Savio River in Italy. Faced with an assault by 3 Panther tanks and 30 infantrymen, Smith stood his ground. He let the lead Panther approach to within 30 feet, a suicidal distance, before firing his PIAT. The tank was knocked out. He then fought off the accompanying infantry with a Thompson submachine gun, protecting his wounded comrade. These actions highlight that while the PIAT was mechanically flawed, in the hands of determined men, it was a devastating equalizer. However, the weapon was not without its detractors, and honest assessments from the front lines often mixed respect with loathing. Sergeant Wagger Thornton, a hero of the Pegasus Bridge assault, called the PIAT a load of rubbish in terms of range. While the official manuals claimed an effective range of 100 to 115 yards against moving targets, veterans like Thornton knew that 50 yards was the realistic maximum. Beyond that, the slow flight time of the bomb gave the target time to move, and the steep trajectory made aiming a guessing game. Thornton's warning to new recruits was stark: you must never miss. The reload time, grappling with that immense spring, meant that if the first shot failed to kill the tank would almost certainly kill the operator before a second round could be chambered. This created an immense psychological burden on the PIAT teams, who had to hold their fire until the enemy was practically on top of them, knowing they likely only had one chance. Comparatively, the American bazooka had its own litany of failures that validated the British decision to stick with the PIAT. The M1 bazooka's introduction in North Africa during Operation Torch was a disaster. Rushed into service with inadequate training, it failed to stop enemy tanks in several engagements, leading General Patton to issue a scathing critique, relegating the weapon to a last resort status. The electrical ignition system of the bazooka was notoriously fragile. Batteries failed in the cold, contacts corroded in the salt air of the Pacific and the humidity of the jungle, and rockets often failed to fire. Furthermore, the propellant in the early rockets sometimes didn't burn completely before leaving the tube, spraying burning powder into the face of the operator. While the bazooka was lighter and could be reloaded faster by a 2-man team, its inability to penetrate the frontal armor of heavy German tanks like the Tiger, a limitation it shared with the PIAT, combined with its reliability issues, made it far from the wonder weapon it is sometimes portrayed as. The Germans, ironically, were the ones who truly unlocked the potential of the rocket launcher. Capturing bazookas in Tunisia, they recognized the utility of the concept but immediately saw its flaws. They reverse-engineered the design and scaled it up to create the Panzerschreck. By increasing the caliber to 88 mm, they created a weapon with vastly superior penetration to both the bazooka and the PIAT, capable of defeating 160 mm of armor. The Panzerschreck was clumsy and heavy, but it was lethal. American troops who encountered captured German anti-tank weapons often preferred them to their own standard-issue gear. This German evolution highlighted that while the British were correct to reject the M1 bazooka in 1942, the principle of rocketry was indeed the future, even if the technology hadn't quite matured. The limitations of the PIAT became even more apparent as the war dragged on and tank armor thickened. Both the PIAT and the bazooka struggled against the late-war German Scherzen. Armored skirts designed to detonate shaped charges prematurely, dissipating the jet of molten copper before it could penetrate the main hull. By the time of the Korean War, the inadequacy of World War II-era anti-tank weapons was laid bare. At the Battle of Ozan in 1950, American task forces fired dozens of 2.36-inch bazooka rockets at North Korean T-34 tanks with almost zero effect, watching them bounce off the hulls. This disaster spurred the rapid deployment of the M20 Super Bazooka, a 3.5-inch weapon that finally provided the necessary punch. The PIAT, meanwhile, soldiered on into the early 1950s but had reached the end of its evolutionary line. The spigot mortar concept was simply too heavy, too range-limited, and too complex to justify further development. When the British Army finally retired the PIAT, they replaced it with the American M20 Super Bazooka, conceding that rocketry had finally caught up to the requirements of the battlefield. Ultimately, the lineage of modern infantry anti-tank weapons traces back to the bazooka, not the PIAT. The Soviet RPG-7, the American M72 Law, and the modern Javelin are all descendants of the rocket-propelled concept. The PIAT was an evolutionary dead end, a technological cul-de-sac. However, history must judge weapons not by their legacy, but by their utility in the moment they were needed. In the specific context of 1943 to 1945, the British decision was vindicated. The British doctrine of fighting from prepared positions, in urban centers, and in close terrain required a weapon that didn't advertise its position with a massive explosion of dust and flame. They needed a weapon that could turn a farmhouse into a fortress. The PIAT, for all its clumsiness, its brutal recoil, and its punishing weight, was that weapon. It was available when it was needed, produced in massive numbers, over 115,000 units, and it allowed the infantry to stand their ground. The rejection of the bazooka was not a failure of imagination, but a triumph of specific tactical foresight. The British soldier trudging through the mud of Italy or the snow of the Ardennes might have cursed the heavy lump of steel on his back, but when a Panther tank turned the corner and the turret began to rotate, he knew that he could fire from the shadows, strike silently, and vanish. In the brutal calculus of war, that slight edge in survivability was worth more than all the lightweight convenience in the world. The PIAT was crude, brutal, and ugly, but it worked, and in the existential struggle against fascism, that was the only metric that mattered.